The world was not always as we know it. Long before cities rose from stone, before words were carved into clay or inked onto parchment, there was silence, a silence broken only by the wind brushing through tall grasses, by the cries of distant animals, and by the crackle of firelight on the edge of darkness. This was the stage of humanity's earliest chapters, a scattered people, fragile in number, bound by kinship and survival, walking the thin line between life and extinction. Across the landscapes of prehistoric Africa, rivers shimmered under pale skies. Herds of antelope grazed cautiously near watering holes. Lions stalked in the shadows, and in caves tucked into cliffsides, small groups of Homo sapiens huddled close to flames, sharing warmth against the chill of night. They did not know it, but they were balanced on a knife's edge. For all their ingenuity, for all their quiet resilience, they remained vulnerable to forces larger than themselves, forces not of claw or fang, but of Earth itself. Above this seemingly quiet world, the planet's heart was stirring. Deep beneath the crust, molten chambers shifted and roared. Pressure built in silence, biding its time. The humans who gathered roots and roasted meat over open fires could not sense the danger brewing. To them, the night sky was a dome of stars, timeless and eternal. But far away, beyond their horizons, the Earth was preparing to unleash one of the most violent events in its long history. It would begin, as catastrophes often do, without warning. The ground would tremble. A mountain would tear itself open. Fire, smoke, and ash would pour into the sky, rising higher than any storm cloud, higher than even the loftiest imagination of those who watched in terror. The light of the sun would dim, smothered by veils of dust and ash drifting across continents. In the space of days, the rhythm of the earth would falter. Crops would fail before they could grow. Animals would wander in confusion as grasslands withered. A winter would come, not a winter of seasons, but a winter of years, perhaps even centuries. For humanity, it would be the closest brush with annihilation we have ever faced. When we think of extinction, we often imagine the dinosaurs, wiped away by fire from the heavens. Yet in our own story, the threat did not fall from the sky but rose from within the earth itself. Scientists today believe that our species, every single one of us alive today, descends from a shockingly small group of survivors. A population so reduced that it might have fit within a single valley, a mere handful of thousands, perhaps fewer. If chance had tilted even slightly against them, if their fires had gone out, or if their children had not lived long enough to bear their own, the story of humanity would have ended before it had truly begun. To imagine this is to imagine silence, the silence of a world without us. No footsteps echoing across tundras, no voices rising into song, no cities stretching toward the sky. Only the wind, the rivers, the forests, and the animals would remain. The earth would continue, as it always does, indifferent to the loss of one small species. And yet something remarkable happened. Against the odds, against hunger, against cold and fear, small bands of humans endured. They clung to warmth where they could find it, they scavenged and adapted, and they carried within them the spark of a future they could not possibly foresee. But survival was never guaranteed. It was not strength that saved us, nor was it dominance. It was fragility itself, tested to its breaking point, that revealed the quiet resilience of our kind. For in the face of an earth that seemed determined to sweep us away, humans discovered something more enduring than stone and more powerful than fire. They discovered each other, bonds of kinship, of memory, of shared struggle, that turned small groups into something larger, something capable of weathering the storm. If history had tilted only slightly differently, none of us would be here. You would not be listening. I would not be speaking. There would be no stories, no memories, no record of human thought at all. The entire arc of our existence hangs on the slender thread of survival in that long, dark winter. This is not just a story of catastrophe. It is not only a tale of fire and ash. It is the story of of the moment when humanity itself was tested, when every breath was an act of defiance, and when every heartbeat carried forward the possibility of all future generations. What does it mean to stand at the edge of annihilation? What does it mean to survive when survival seems almost impossible? In the shadows of that ancient winter, our ancestors faced these questions not with words, but with lives lived on the edge of extinction. In this journey, we will walk into that darkness. We will follow the threads of evidence left in stone, in bone, and in the code of our own DNA. We will listen for echoes in myths and memories, for whispers of a time when the earth itself seemed to turn against us. And we will uncover the story of the winter that almost ended all human life. Before the skies darkened, before the ash cloud stretched across the horizon, the world of early Homo sapiens was already precarious. To imagine their lives is to step back into an age when survival was not assumed, when every day demanded ingenuity, and when the boundaries between thriving and perishing were paper-thin. This was not yet a world of vast nations or towering monuments. Humanity was young, young in number, young in culture, young in its grasp of the earth's rhythms. Our ancestors lived in scattered groups, rarely numbering more than a few dozen souls. They gathered where water flowed and food could be hunted, moved with the migrations of animals, and adapted to landscapes as diverse as river valleys, coastal plains, and mountain forests. The tools they carried were simple yet profound: stone flakes sharpened against one another, wooden spears hardened in fire, bone awls to pierce skins. These were not objects of comfort but of survival. With them, people cut meat, scraped hides, dug for roots, and defended themselves against predators. To us, they may seem primitive, but for them each tool was a thread binding them to life. Firelight was perhaps the greatest of these threads. To sit beside a fire in the Paleolithic world was to carve out a small sanctuary against darkness. It offered warmth, protection from prowling beasts, and the means to cook food, transforming what was dangerous or inedible into sustenance. Around fire, stories were told, not in written words, but in gestures, sounds, and perhaps the first fragile stirrings of myth. Humanity was already a storyteller, even before language had settled into complex form. Around flickering flames, hands cast shadows on cave walls. Perhaps those shadows became the ancestors of art. Perhaps they were the first reflections of an inner world, the dawning awareness that survival was more than flesh and bone, more than hunger and fear. Yet for all this creativity, our ancestors lived in fragility. The environment did not give generously. Droughts came and went. Predators stalked in grass taller than a man's head. Illness, injury, or a failed hunt could unravel the lives of an entire band. Infants were born into uncertainty. Mothers and fathers bore the weight of survival not only for themselves but for the fragile continuity of their kin. Still, humanity endured by leaning into adaptability. We were not the fastest, nor the strongest, nor the fiercest of animals. But we could learn. We could observe the migrations of animals, track the cycles of plants, and fashion shelters against storms. We could remember where food had been found before and pass that knowledge forward. The fragile dawn of humanity was fragile, yes, but it was also inventive, restless, always seeking. It was during this time that small sparks of culture began to flicker. Shell beads found at ancient sites suggest that adornment, symbolism, and perhaps even identity were taking shape. These were not merely practical creatures, they were humans in the deepest sense, aware of themselves, aware of each other, reaching for meaning beyond mere survival. And yet all of this was balanced on the edge of chance. For every moment of triumph, a successful hunt, a safe birth, a new tool discovered, there was risk. A broken leg could mean death. A dry season could scatter entire families. When night fell and the fire burned low, there must have been moments of profound vulnerability, when the vastness of the dark pressed down on fragile lives. But perhaps it was this very fragility that gave our species its strength. Fragility demanded cooperation. Alone, a human was nothing more than prey, soft-skinned, slow-footed, vulnerable. Together, they could share burdens, split tasks, and face dangers as one. The fragile dawn of humanity was not built upon isolation but upon kinship. Around those fires, within those shelters, bonds were formed that would echo across tens of thousands of years, right down to us. This was the world before the storm, a world already hard, already demanding, already full of trials that tested the boundaries of endurance. Yet it was also a world alive with possibility. The first traces of art, the first glimmers of symbolic thought, the first true migrations beyond Africa, all of these belong to this age. Humanity was stretching, reaching, beginning to imagine itself not just as a creature surviving in a landscape, but as a being shaping and interpreting it. It was a delicate balance, a dawn barely breaking. And it was in this moment, when humanity had just begun to rise from the shadows of its animal past, that catastrophe would strike. The eruption that was coming did not fall upon a mighty civilization with granaries and walls and armies. It fell upon scattered bands of hunters and gatherers, numbering in the mere thousands, each one clinging to survival day by day. Imagine the fragility of it, a world in which every life mattered because there were so few. A world in which the death of one elder could mean the loss of vital knowledge, where to find water, how to make fire, which roots could cure illness. A world in which the survival of a child could carry forward the thread of an entire lineage. This was the humanity that stood at the threshold of disaster. A people not yet masters of their world, but students of it. A species not yet secure, but always improvising. The fragile dawn of humanity was a moment of beginnings that almost ended before they had time to flourish. And it is here, standing on the edge of this fragile dawn, that we must pause and understand what was truly at stake. For the winter that approached was not merely another hardship. It was not another drought, nor another failed hunt, nor another predator lurking in the dark. It was a force unlike any they had yet faced, a force vast enough to silence the earth itself, to smother sun and sky, to press down upon every living thing with the weight of inevitability. Against such a storm, fragility should not have survived. And yet, impossibly, it did. 74,000 years ago, in the shadow of what is now Indonesia, the earth convulsed with a fury unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Where today Lake Toba rests in quiet stillness, a mirror of sky framed by volcanic ridges, there was once a mountain, vast, ancient, restless. Beneath its surface lay a chamber of molten rock so immense that, when it finally tore itself open, it reshaped the climate of the planet and scarred the history of life itself. The eruption began in fire. Pressure, building for centuries, at last broke free. Explosions ripped through the mountain, tearing stone into ash, hurling boulders skyward, sending rivers of lava cascading down slopes. The roar would have been unlike anything the human ear had ever known, a sound that could flatten forests, a sound that seemed to unmake the world. For days, the volcano raged. Columns of ash and smoke rose into the stratosphere, higher than any thunderstorm, higher even than the flight of birds. The plume stretched tens of kilometers into the air, a black tower clawing at the heavens. Lightning crackled through the clouds as ash particles collided, igniting the sky in furious storms. To those who saw it, there could have been no doubt, the earth itself was alive, and it was angry. The violence of Toba dwarfed ordinary eruptions. It was not the eruption of a single mountain, but the tearing open of a vast wound in the crust of the planet. Entire valleys were buried, forests ignited, rivers boiled, and all across the Indian Ocean, shockwaves rippled outward, tsunamis crashing upon distant shores. Estimates suggest that nearly 3,000 cubic kilometers of rock and ash were ejected into the atmosphere, enough to bury entire countries, enough to blanket the globe in a thin veil of dust. To imagine this is to imagine a scale that defies comprehension. Mount St. Helens, Krakatoa, Vesuvius, infamous names of volcanic fury, were but sparks compared to the inferno of Toba. This was a super-eruption, an event that reshaped not only landscapes but climates, not only seasons but centuries. For those humans living within sight of the mountain, survival was impossible. Villages, forests, and herds were annihilated in moments, swept away by pyroclastic flows moving faster than the eye could follow, hotter than any fire they had known. Even hundreds of kilometers away, skies blackened, ash fell like snow, and breathing became a struggle. Across continents, the world dimmed. Yet the true devastation of Toba was not in its immediate fury, but in its aftermath. The ash that poured into the sky did not simply fall back to the ground. It lingered. High in the stratosphere, fine particles spread across the globe, forming a shroud that dimmed the sun. Daylight weakened, temperatures dropped, rain patterns shifted, plants struggled to grow in muted light, their leaves pale and stunted. Animals, in turn, weakened as food became scarce. This was the beginning of what scientists call a volcanic winter, not a season, but a long and grinding shadow over the earth. For years, perhaps even decades, the planet remained cooler, harsher, less forgiving. The eruption had not merely scarred a region, it had shaken the entire climate system. To the small, scattered populations of Homo sapiens, the effects were catastrophic. Already fragile, already vulnerable, they now faced an enemy they could not see and could not fight, the slow strangling of their world. Rivers froze earlier. Grasslands withered. Herds migrated differently, or died in alarming numbers. Crops, where any had been gathered, failed. Even the oceans shifted as currents cooled and fish stocks dwindled. Imagine living through it. Imagine waking each morning to a sky that never truly brightened, to air thick with dust, to a landscape that no longer responded to the rhythms of sun and season. Children cried with hunger. Elders shivered with cold. Hunters returned with empty hands, again and again. Fire gave warmth, but it could not summon food from barren soil or bring animals back to empty valleys. It is here that the story of Toba becomes not just geological but human, because it is here that our species teetered on the brink of erasure. Population estimates suggest that humanity may have been reduced to a few thousand breeding individuals, a number so small that, had it dropped just slightly further, the line of our species might have ended. It is a sobering thought that every person alive today carries within their DNA the legacy of this near extinction, descended from a narrow handful who endured the storm. The science behind this is written into our very blood. Genetic bottlenecks, sharp reductions in diversity, suggest that something profound narrowed our lineage at this time. Though debate continues, many researchers believe Toba's eruption was the trigger. Our diversity collapsed because our numbers collapsed. Survival became a matter not of thriving, but of barely holding on. And yet, even as we reflect on the terror of this eruption, we must also marvel at its paradoxical gift. For in reducing humanity to such fragile numbers, Toba may have forced us to become what we are. The survivors were not only those with strong bodies, but those who could cooperate, innovate, and imagine. Scarcity sharpened intelligence. Hardship deepened social bonds. Out of catastrophe, something new was forged, a humanity tempered by fire and ash. To stand before Toba today is to see only silence. The mountain is gone, replaced by a vast lake, serene and deceptively peaceful. Tourists walk its shores, unaware that here the earth once unleashed its most devastating fury. But beneath those waters lies the memory of fire. Beneath the calm lies the echo of an event that nearly ended us. The Toba catastrophe is not only a story of destruction. It is a story of scale, of how fragile life is in the face of planetary forces, and of how survival is never guaranteed. It is a reminder that our history has not only been shaped by our inventions and our choices, but by the indifferent violence of the earth itself. And as we step forward in this journey, we must carry that memory. For what came after the eruption was not relief, but struggle. The eruption was only the spark. The true test lay in the long, dim years that followed, years when humanity's survival would be decided not by strength or numbers, but by resilience, creativity, and the stubborn will to endure. The eruption of Toba had ended, but the silence it left was far more terrifying than the roar itself. For in that silence lay the slow unraveling of the world. The mountain's fury had subsided, its fires cooled, its thunder faded into memory. Yet high above, in the thin reaches of the stratosphere, the true catastrophe had only begun. Ash and sulfur particles drifted on the winds, spreading across continents, circling the globe. What began as a column rising above a single volcano soon became a shroud that stretched from horizon to horizon. The sun dimmed, veiled behind a haze that turned midday into dusk and dusk into night. Shadows lengthened unnaturally. The warmth of daylight weakened, stolen by the dust that refused to fall. This was no ordinary winter. It was not the turning of seasons, the slow cycle of autumn frost and spring thaw. It was a global winter, unnatural, unyielding. The Earth's heartbeat faltered. Average temperatures plunged by several degrees, enough to wither harvests, enough to change the courses of rivers, enough to grind ecosystems to their knees. For life balanced delicately on warmth and light, and when those were stolen, the chain of survival broke link by link. Forests thinned as trees struggled to drink light. Grasses yellowed, starved of photosynthesis. Plants that had fed herds of grazing animals grew weak and brittle, their leaves pale, their seeds fewer and smaller. Without plants, the animals faltered. Mammoths, aurochs, antelope, and deer wandered across landscapes stripped of green, their bodies leaner each season, their calves fewer, their migrations broken. And where the animals suffered, the hunters who relied on them suffered too. Rains came late or not at all. Snow blanketed regions unaccustomed to it. Ice crept further into lands that had once known only warmth. Lakes shrank, their waters evaporating in strange patterns as weather itself seemed confused, disrupted. Nothing was reliable anymore. Seasons were broken. The earth no longer kept its promises. For the humans who lived through this dimmed world, every day was a question without answer. They woke to skies that never cleared, to horizons blurred by haze. They searched the land for food that no longer grew where it once had. Hunters set out into emptiness, following tracks that vanished because the herds themselves had vanished. Gatherers dug in frozen soil for roots too small to nourish. Children cried in hunger, mothers pressed them close to warm them, but warmth without food could not quiet the emptiness in their stomachs. Fires still burned. Fire was the one gift that could not be stolen by the sky. But its glow was weak against the vast cold pressing in from above. It gave light, but no abundance. It gave comfort, but no certainty. Even fire could not call back the sun. The nights grew longer, and the days seemed no brighter. Imagine living in a world where time itself begins to blur, where day and night are both shadows, where memory of clear sunlight becomes as rare as a dream. For generations that had known the rhythm of dawn and dusk, the endless twilight must have felt like the Earth's betrayal. And yet this betrayal was not swift. It was slow, grinding, relentless. It was not a single disaster, but 1,000 small ones, a failed hunt here, a child lost to cold there, a river running dry where once it had run full. It was death by scarcity, by hunger, by exhaustion. Not all at once, but steadily, season by season, year by year. Entire valleys grew quiet. Caves once marked by smoke grew cold and dark. Some groups wandered, searching for refuge that no longer existed. Others stayed and perished, leaving only silence behind. The world without sunlight was not only a physical trial but a psychological one. To live in unending dimness is to live with despair. To see the horizon gray year after year is to wonder if the light will ever return. Yet the story of this winter is not only one of despair. For even here, even under skies that denied them, humans endured. They learned to seek out what little could be found: shellfish along storm-tossed coasts, hardy roots buried deep, small animals that still scurried through the undergrowth. They adapted. Where plants failed, they turned to marrow in bones. Where hunts failed, they scavenged from carcasses left behind by wolves. Every scrap became precious. But the price was heavy. Populations dwindled. The genetic record of humanity bears scars of this narrowing. It tells us that we came close, unimaginably close, to vanishing. A species reduced to a shadow of its former self, carried forward by only a few. The Earth, meanwhile, wore its cloak of ash with indifference. To the planet, this was but another cycle, another shift in its long, restless life. It had extinguished species before, it would extinguish them again. Humanity's struggle was not the Earth's concern. The winds carried the ash where they would. The skies remained gray. The world was colder, harsher, and quieter. And yet, perhaps it was in this silence that something profound was forged. For when the world grows dark, when all the old patterns are broken, survival becomes invention. Desperation breeds ingenuity. In the world without sunlight, the small sparks of human creativity became more than luxuries, they became lifelines. Still, in these years of dimness, survival was never guaranteed. For every group that adapted, others failed. The extinction of possibility echoed across valleys and forests as human voices fell silent forever. We cannot know their names, their stories, their faces. We can only know that their absence narrowed the future, and that we are the descendants of those who somehow endured. The world without sunlight was not merely an environmental event. It was an existential crucible. It asked the question, can a fragile species, scattered and few, withstand the indifference of planetary catastrophe? The answer, improbable though it was, would shape everything to come. But this was only the beginning. For beyond hunger, beyond cold, beyond the dim skies, there was another test, one written into the very fabric of our survival. A test of numbers. A test of whether enough humans could remain alive long enough to carry the story forward. The skies remained dim. The wind still carried ash. But perhaps the greatest effect of the Toba eruption was not on the land, or the water, or even the animals. It was on us. Humanity itself, scattered, vulnerable, dependent on balance, found its very existence reduced to the narrowest of margins. Geneticists studying the echoes of this time have uncovered something astonishing. Within the fabric of our DNA there are signatures, scars of survival, markers that tell the story of how close we came to being erased. These signs suggest that the human population, once spread widely across Africa and beyond, was reduced to a fraction of its former numbers. Some estimates say that only a few thousand breeding individuals remained. Others go further, suggesting that the number might have dropped to as few as 2,000, perhaps even fewer. Imagine that, a species spread across continents suddenly reduced to the size of a small village. From billions today, to a community that could gather on a single plane. That was the razor's edge on which we balanced. The concept is called a genetic bottleneck. When a population shrinks so drastically, its diversity, its range of possible futures, shrinks with it. Imagine a great river, wide and rushing, filled with countless currents. Now picture that river forced through a narrow gorge, squeezed into a trickle. Whatever passes through emerges changed, less varied, less rich, but still flowing. Humanity was that river. The gorge was the Toba winter. This narrowing shaped us. It unified our genetic heritage, leaving traces in every one of us alive today. If you trace back your lineage, no matter where you are, Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas, it leads to those who endured this bottleneck. We are not just descendants of humans, we are descendants of survivors. Survivors of a winter that nearly stole the future itself. What did it mean, though, to live through such narrowing? For the people themselves, the numbers were not abstract. They were losses felt in the flesh. Villages that dwindled to nothing. Families broken by hunger. Entire bands of hunters and gatherers leaving no descendants at all. Imagine a clan of 20 reduced to 12 one winter, then to 7 the next. Imagine the silence of camps where laughter had once filled the air, the slow unraveling of kinship, the fear in the eyes of those left behind. To those alive then, the bottleneck was not science. It was the constant ache of absence. Yet it was not uniform. Not every group suffered equally. Some landscapes offered more refuge than others. Along coasts, shellfish may have provided a lifeline, stubborn against cold seas. In wetlands, roots and tubers could still be dug, sustaining small groups. In certain valleys, game animals lingered long enough to see families through another winter. Survival was a lottery, dictated by geography, chance, and ingenuity. And so, while many vanished, some endured. Endured not because they were stronger or wiser in every way, but because their environment allowed it, and because they clung to one another with tenacity. The bottleneck was not a judgment. It was a filter, impersonal, arbitrary, and merciless. Still, those who passed through it were changed. With fewer people came fewer exchanges of ideas, fewer innovations shared between groups. Progress slowed. For thousands of years, human culture may have stagnated, its diversity of thought as reduced as its diversity of genes. But reduction is not the same as extinction. Narrowing is not the same as ending. The river, though reduced, still flowed. Humanity survived, scarred, but alive. And in survival, new stories were born, stories of resilience, stories of adaptation, stories of memory carried forward into future generations. Think of this: every language spoken today, every song sung, every child born, all of it comes from the line that made it through this single bottleneck. It was not inevitable. It was not guaranteed. It was the outcome of countless small decisions, countless acts of endurance. A mother feeding her child the last root. A hunter choosing to share his catch rather than hoard it. A clan deciding to migrate, or deciding to stay. Each choice, each gesture carried forward the fragile possibility of tomorrow. And perhaps, in this narrowing, something else was forged. Community became not just a comfort, but a necessity. To share food was to save lives. To protect the weak was to preserve the group. To pass on knowledge, where to find water, how to light fire, how to track in the snow, was to keep memory alive when memory itself could die with the old. In the bottleneck, humanity learned not just to endure as individuals, but to endure as families, as clans, as interconnected webs of care. The genetic evidence is clear: we are the descendants of a few. But the emotional truth is deeper: we are the descendants of those who refuse to let go of one another, even when the world itself seemed to let go of them. When we speak of the bottleneck, it is easy to imagine it as numbers, as graphs, as cold statistics. But it was also a story of firelit nights where children clung to their parents, of migrations across snow where footsteps stretched thin, of songs sung to keep despair at bay. It was, in the end, a story of human spirit tested by the indifference of nature. The winter did not end quickly. It stretched on, uncertain and cruel. But within it, the survivors carried forward the flame of humanity, a flame small enough to be extinguished by a single gust, yet somehow strong enough to burn on. This is the paradox of the bottleneck. It was both our near destruction and our foundation. It stripped us to the bone, yet it bound us together. It left us fragile, yet it made us resilient. And from that narrow passage, everything that followed became possible. The bottleneck was not the end. It was the threshold. Beyond it lay the slow return of light, the regrowth of forests, the re-expansion of animals and plants. Beyond it lay new migrations, new inventions, new worlds to discover. But first humanity had to survive the crucible, to emerge few in number, but unbroken in spirit. In the endless cold, survival was more than a question of calories or warmth. It was also a question of spirit. Without hope, without meaning, the effort to endure would have been unbearable. And so, in the shadow of catastrophe, humans did what they had always done: they gathered around the fire. Picture it: the winds howl outside, the land lies in darkness, but within the fragile circle of flame there is light, there is warmth, there is us. The fire becomes more than fuel. It is a boundary, separating safety from danger, belonging from exile, the known from the terrifying unknown. Around it, we find one another. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans were already using fire for cooking, for protection, for heat, long before Toba erupted. But in the years of volcanic winter, the firelight may have taken on new meaning. It was a hearth, yes, but also a sanctuary, the one place where stories could be told, where fears could be spoken, where identity could be remembered. In the firelight, memory survived. Elders passed down knowledge of hunting trails, of edible plants, of where water might still be found under the ice. They became the keepers of resilience, transmitting fragile wisdom to the young. Every story was a survival kit. Every myth was a map of meaning. To lose those stories would have been to lose the very tools required to persist. And so, people told stories, not only of the practical world, but of the invisible one. The gods, the spirits, the ancestors, these two gathered by the fire. Through myth, the survivors explained the unexplainable, gave shape to the chaos, and reminded themselves that even in disaster they were part of something larger than hunger and fear. Imagine a mother singing to her child in the dim glow, her voice quivering but steady. Imagine hunters returning with almost nothing, yet still listening to the words of the elders, who spoke of better days, of cycles that turned, of light that would one day return. These were not luxuries. They were lifelines. The firelight was also a teacher of intimacy. In its circle, people huddled close. Bonds deepened. Shared suffering drew clans together. Where scarcity might have bred only rivalry, it also demanded cooperation. The winter punished selfishness. Those who hoarded risked the collapse of their group. Those who shared increased the chances of survival for all. Around the fire, human empathy was not abstract philosophy, it was necessity. And here, perhaps, we glimpse something profound. The very traits we most associate with humanity, compassion, storytelling, cooperation, memory, may have been sharpened in these dark years. When the world closed in, the fire kept open the possibility of tomorrow. We might even say the fire was the first classroom. Children learned to listen, to imagine, to ask questions, to rehearse the rituals of their people. Laughter still existed in these camps too, faint, fragile, but real. Games, jokes, songs, all ways of keeping despair at bay. Even in the harshest winters, the human mind refused to live only in silence. The fire also connected the living with the dead. Ashes swirled above the flames just as volcanic ash covered the sky. Perhaps survivors saw in the smoke the presence of those they had lost. Rituals of burial, of mourning, of speaking to the unseen, these may have deepened, giving structure to grief. The firelight gave shape to sorrow, just as it gave shape to joy. Every flicker of flame was defiance. To keep the fire burning meant to resist the void outside. To feed it with scarce wood meant choosing to live one more night. Some nights, surely, the fires went out, and with them entire groups. But for those who kept their flames alive, the light itself became a symbol, fragile, threatened, yet enduring. It is no accident that in so many later cultures, fire is sacred. In myth after myth across continents, the flame is divine, stolen from the gods, gifted to humanity, guarded as treasure. Perhaps these myths are distant echoes of that time, when fire was all that stood between survival and extinction. The survivors of Toba may not have spoken of gods of fire yet, but they lived the truth that without flame there could be no future. Let us imagine, then, a night in that age. A handful of families gathered in a cave, the fire at their center. Outside, ash drifts down like snow, silent, endless. Inside, the fire crackles. An elder speaks. Children listen. A mother hums softly. A father sharpens a tool. A teenager stares into the glow, dreaming of a world he has never seen, a world where the sky is blue. This was the survivor's firelight, a circle of endurance against the dark. It was not grand, it was not certain, it was not even safe. But it was enough. Enough to keep a people together. Enough to pass through the bottleneck. Enough to ensure that one day, thousands of generations later, we could tell their story. We too sit in the glow of fire, only now it is electric light, the glow of screens. Yet the essence is the same. We gather in circles, we share stories, we pass on knowledge, we keep memory alive. The fire has changed form, but its spirit continues. And every spark today descends from those fragile flames that flickered in the volcanic night. The survivor's firelight was humanity's lighthouse, shining not outward into the sea, but inward into the soul. It told us we were not alone. It reminded us that we were still human. And it carried us, trembling but unbroken, into the dawn that would one day return. Step beyond the fragile warmth of the fire, and the world is unrecognizable. The eruption has passed, but its shadow lingers, a sky without color, a land without voice. Ash blankets the earth, layer upon layer, soft to the touch, yet heavy with consequence. The silence is unnatural, almost unbearable. It is the silence of absence, the absence of birdsong, of running rivers, of living green. For those who walked across this ashen land, every step was a reminder of loss. Once familiar paths disappeared beneath gray dunes. Rivers clogged with volcanic silt slowed, changed course, or dried. The air, still tainted with sulfur, stung the lungs. And as the months stretched into years, the world's ecosystems began to unravel. Forests, already stressed by sudden cooling, collapsed under the weight of ash. Leaves could not photosynthesize through the shroud. Trees withered. Entire swathes of woodland became graveyards of trunks, standing silent, stripped of life. Grasslands too faltered, their roots suffocated, their cycles disrupted. What little remained green was quickly grazed down by desperate animals. And the animals themselves, they suffered as profoundly as humans. Herds starved when pastures failed. Predator and prey alike dwindled. The great migrations faltered, cut off by barren stretches of land that offered no sustenance. Across continents, populations of large mammals thinned. Some species vanished forever, slipping silently out of the story of life. The silence was not only physical but ecological. The intricate symphony of interdependence, insects pollinating flowers, birds scattering seeds, predators culling herds, lost its rhythm. Each absence echoed outward, unraveling connections built over millions of years. What was once a flourishing web of life became a fragile, frayed net, torn by catastrophe. For humans, this silence meant hunger. Hunting became a desperate gamble. Where once there had been abundance, herds of antelope, flocks of birds, rivers teeming with fish, now there was scarcity. Hunters returned more often empty-handed. Gatherers scoured ash-choked landscapes for roots and tubers, only to find them spoiled or gone. Every failed search was another step closer to despair. But this silence also reshaped perception. Imagine walking into a forest where no insects buzz, no leaves rustle, no animals stir. The very absence of sound becomes a presence, pressing against the mind, unsettling, alien. Survivors must have felt they were living in a world abandoned by life itself, a planet turned against them. And yet, even in this devastation, life did not vanish completely. Some seeds, buried deep enough, survived. Some animals, small and resilient, adapted, scavenging, burrowing, hiding. Certain species of plants, capable of enduring cold or sprouting quickly after disturbance, began to reappear. The silence was not absolute. Faint whispers of survival threaded through it. In caves, in sheltered valleys, in pockets where ashfall was lighter, ecosystems clung to existence. These oases became vital. Humans who found them discovered fragile refuges, a stand of surviving trees, a river still running, a patch of grassland where animals still grazed. To stumble upon such places was to stumble upon hope itself. Still, the larger picture was grim. Earth systems were in shock. Climate records suggest that the years after Toba's eruption were colder than any living human had experienced before. This sudden cooling, combined with the ashfall, meant that even when the sky began to clear, recovery was painfully slow. Generations lived and died under this silence before balance returned. And what of the survivors' inner worlds? The silence must have carved itself into their memory. For cultures shaped by landscape and animal, the loss of these companions was a spiritual wound as much as a material one. Rituals may have been performed to mourn vanished herds. Songs may have been sung to call back birds that never returned. Ash and silence became not only physical conditions, but cultural scars. Even so, the silence was not permanent. Slowly, painfully, life crept back. Pioneering plants broke through the ash, the first shoots of green piercing gray. Insects returned to pollinate them. Birds followed, then small mammals, then larger herds. The silence cracked, piece by piece, with each voice that re-entered the chorus of the world. But for a time, perhaps decades, the survivors lived in a world muted almost beyond recognition. And in that unnatural hush, they endured. They became attuned to faint sounds, the scuttle of a lizard, the flap of a raven, the drip of water in a cave. Every noise mattered, because every noise meant life. Today, when scientists dig into ancient soils and find the ash layers from Toba's eruption, they see evidence of this silence. Pollen records showing sudden die-offs, charcoal remnants of struggling forests, bones of animals that never recovered. The earth itself remembers. And in these traces we glimpse not only the scale of the catastrophe, but also the fragility of the systems that sustain us. The silence after Toba was a warning written across time. Life can falter, balance can collapse, abundance can turn to absence. Yet it also whispered resilience. for life did not end. It bent, it struggled, it changed, and it endured. Ash and silence were the inheritance of the survivors. But from that inheritance, they rebuilt their world. And from their endurance, we inherit our own lives. When we speak of nearly ending all human life, it is not poetic exaggeration. It is a measurable truth inscribed in our very DNA. Modern science, digging into the genetic code of billions of people alive today, has discovered something extraordinary. Humanity once passed through a bottleneck so narrow that our entire species may have been reduced to just a few thousand, or perhaps even a few hundred, breeding individuals. This bottleneck coincides with the aftermath of the Toba eruption. It is as though a hand pressed down on the diversity of humankind, leaving behind only a narrow thread of survivors through which all of us are descended. We are, every one of us, children of that thread, the last flame of humanity that refused to go out. To understand this, we must first imagine what the bottleneck means. Before Toba, Homo sapiens had already spread across Africa and were beginning to push outward into new territories. Populations were scattered, experimenting with different ways of life, different tools, different cultures. Diversity, both genetic and cultural, was flourishing. Then the eruption came. Ash and silence stripped the earth. Herds collapsed, plant life faltered, and with them, the humans who depended on these webs of life. Entire populations must have been cut off from each other, stranded in uninhabitable landscapes. Some communities vanished entirely, their bloodlines erased forever. Others, smaller and luckier, clung to survival in pockets where conditions were less harsh. A fertile valley, a well-watered refuge, a coastal strip with access to fish, these became the last sanctuaries of our species. The genetic evidence today shows a striking uniformity. Compared to many other species, human beings are unusually similar to each other. Two chimpanzees from neighboring forests may be more genetically different than any two humans on opposite sides of the globe. This lack of diversity is not natural for a species with our population size. It is the fingerprint of a near-extinction event. Imagine what this meant on the ground. Communities shrank. Perhaps a band of a few dozen huddled together in a single cave, their numbers dwindling with each harsh winter. Perhaps another band eked out a living on the shore, scavenging shellfish when hunting failed. Each group knew, whether consciously or not, that their survival hung by a thread. A single outbreak of disease, a single failed season, and they would vanish forever. It is staggering to consider how close we came to silence. Genetic models suggest that, at the lowest point, the breeding population of Homo sapiens could have fallen to between 2,000 and 10,000 individuals worldwide. Some even suggest numbers lower still, perhaps only a few hundred. That is fewer than the number of students on a single modern university campus, fewer than the spectators at a small village football match. From such fragile numbers, all of humanity today descends. This bottleneck did more than simply reduce numbers. It reshaped us. With so few survivors, every gene carried forward into the future bore disproportionate weight. Mutations that happened in those desperate centuries became part of the universal human story. The immune systems we carry, the quirks in our metabolism, even some predispositions of our psychology, all were forged in this crucible of survival. But beyond biology, consider culture. Small groups cut off from one another developed unique ways of coping with disaster. Some may have leaned on rituals to give meaning to the silence. Others innovated, creating new tools or strategies for hunting scarce prey. Still others may have turned to cooperation, binding their groups together with stories and traditions that gave strength when the world offered little. Only the most adaptive, the most resourceful, the most united endured. And so the bottleneck was not only a winnowing of numbers, but a winnowing of possibilities. Entire cultural experiments were lost. Whole traditions vanished with the groups who carried them. What remains in us today is the legacy of those who succeeded in surviving. The resilience, the stubbornness, the ingenuity, these were the qualities that passed through the eye of the needle. The bottleneck also carried consequences into the distant future. With so little diversity, humans became more vulnerable to certain diseases. Genetic drift, the random loss of variation, meant that future populations would bear similarities difficult to explain without such a reduction. When scientists look at mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mothers, they see evidence pointing back to a common mother, not literally one woman, but a population so small that it looks genetically as if we all share her. The same is true with the Y chromosome lineages of men. This is why the story of Toba resonates not just in ash layers and cooling records, but in our blood, our bones, our very cells. We carry the memory of that winter within us. Every heartbeat is a reminder that our ancestors did not give in, though the odds were crushing. And what did this mean for them, day to day? Perhaps it meant choosing not to wander, but to stay where food could still be gathered. Perhaps it meant alliances between groups who once competed, banding together against the weight of a hostile world. Perhaps it meant rethinking what it meant to be human at all, shifting from mere survival to endurance, from living for the day to living for the generations. The bottleneck was more than a trial, it was a transformation. Humanity emerged smaller, scarred, and deeply altered, but also more unified. From a handful of survivors, a global species would one day rise. From the ashes of near extinction came the spark of a future civilization. It is sobering to realize how fragile our story was. Without those few survivors, there would be no cities, no music, no philosophy, no science. No language to tell this tale, no one to remember that a winter nearly ended us all. The bottleneck is a humbling reminder. Civilization, with all its wonders, rests on the perseverance of a tiny group of ancestors who endured the silence after Toba. The billions of us alive today are their descendants, the living proof that humanity, though shaken, did not break. If the genetic bottleneck after Toba was the biological test of our species, then culture was the flame that kept us alive through the long night. For survival is not only a matter of food and shelter, it is also a matter of meaning. When the world turns against you, when the cold is unrelenting and the skies remain dim, what keeps a person from giving up? What keeps a community from splintering apart? The answer, in part, is found in the fire. Imagine a band of survivors huddled around a small blaze at the mouth of a cave. Outside, ash falls like silent snow. The wind howls across a barren plain, carrying with it the scent of death and decay. Yet here, inside the cave, the flames crackle, and their glow casts dancing shadows on the rock walls. It is in this glow that humanity found something more enduring than stone tools or animal hides, the beginnings of culture as we know it. The fire was warmth, yes. It was light. It was safety against predators. But it was also a gathering point, a place where voices rose, stories were told, songs were hummed, and rituals began to form. In the bleakest winters, when food was scarce and fear was constant, the fire offered something no spear or flint could, a sense of togetherness. Anthropologists believe that it was in these crucibles of survival that many of our symbolic behaviors gained strength. Simple rituals, a chant before a hunt, a gesture of thanks after a meal, a carved mark on a rock, may have deepened during these years of crisis. These rituals were more than superstition, they were ways of binding people together, of giving them a shared sense of order in a world that had turned chaotic. Consider language. While the exact timeline of its emergence is debated, these centuries may have forced language to evolve more rapidly. Complex communication was no longer a luxury, it was a matter of survival. How else could small groups coordinate hunts when prey was scarce? How else could they pass down knowledge of safe plants, of hidden springs, of ways to keep warm? Around the fire, words became tools sharper than flint, and stories became maps of survival. We should not underestimate the power of those stories. When a child asked why the sky was gray, or why the animals had vanished, an elder may have answered not with silence but with myth. Perhaps they told of spirits angry with humankind, or of a great beast devouring the sun. These explanations, however fanciful, gave people a framework for enduring the incomprehensible. They transformed despair into narrative, and narrative gave hope. The fire also shaped cooperation. In times of plenty, bands could afford to quarrel, to splinter off, to compete for territory. But in a world stripped bare, cooperation became essential. Around the fire, food was shared, plans were made, and bonds were reinforced. The glow of the flames turned strangers into kin. Those groups who mastered this deep cooperation, who learned to rely on trust, reciprocity, and empathy, were the ones who endured. It is here that we glimpse the roots of something profoundly human, symbolic art. The earliest known carvings, pigments, and ornaments date to around this period, some not long after the Toba eruption. Was it desperation that drove us to create symbols? Or was it the need to say, we are still here? Perhaps the marks etched into bone, or the beads strung from shells, were ways of proclaiming continuity in a world that threatened to erase us. Culture became defiance against extinction. Picture a mother painting her child's face with ochre before a hunt, not because it made the hunt easier, but because it reminded them of who they were. Picture a group chanting together before stepping into the night, the rhythm of their voices synchronizing their hearts and minds. Picture a burial, the careful placing of stones or flowers over the body of lost kin, a gesture that said, even in death, we honor one another. These sparks of culture burned against the darkness. And so the fire was more than flame. It was memory. It was meaning. It was the heartbeat of a community. In the long volcanic winter, many groups may have perished. But those who carried strong cultural practices had a better chance. They had rituals to soothe fear, myths to sustain hope, and social bonds to hold them together when scarcity might have torn them apart. This is the paradox of disaster. It destroys, but it also forges. The near extinction after Toba may have honed the very qualities that later defined us as human: cooperation, imagination, resilience, and shared belief. In other words, it was not only biology that passed through the bottleneck, but culture itself. Modern anthropology shows us that even the smallest acts of symbolic life can serve enormous survival purposes. A song can calm the anxious. A myth can justify enduring hunger. A ritual can coordinate a hunt. And in those desperate centuries, these sparks of culture were not luxuries. They were lifelines. When we look back at cave art tens of thousands of years later, we often see it as art for art's sake. But perhaps its roots were planted here, in the shadow of catastrophe, where to create was to resist despair. To carve a line in stone was to say, we exist, and we will continue. So, as the fire burned against the ashen night, humanity kept more than its bodies alive. It kept its spirit alive. From those flames came the first embers of culture that would one day grow into civilizations, religions, philosophies, and stories told across the world. Every book written, every song sung, every ritual performed today, all of it can trace a fragile lineage back to those ancient fires in the dark. It is humbling to realize that without these sparks, we might not have endured. Without culture, survival may have been biologically possible, but spiritually unbearable. The fire gave us more than warmth. It gave us a reason to keep walking into the cold dawn of the next day. When we imagine the survivors of the Toba eruption, we often think only of our own kind, Homo sapiens, huddled in caves, their fires flickering against ash-darkened skies. But the truth is more complex. At the time of this catastrophe, we were not the only humans alive. Across Eurasia roamed the Neanderthals. In Asia stirred the enigmatic Denisovans. And perhaps there were other archaic groups as well, their traces only faint whispers in our DNA. The volcanic winter was not merely a test of our species, it was a trial of an entire family. The Neanderthals, our closest relatives, were already masters of survival in harsh climates. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had endured the brutal ice ages of Europe and Western Asia. Stocky, strong, and resourceful, they were expert hunters of mammoth and bison. Their bodies were built for cold, their societies knit tightly by kinship. If any human species could stare down the darkness of a volcanic winter, it was them. And yet, the eruption may have struck their homelands particularly hard. Europe and Western Asia, already prone to cold, would have suffered catastrophic cooling. Prey animals may have vanished from the tundra. Vegetation would have collapsed. For Neanderthals, who relied heavily on large game, this disruption was devastating. While they endured for tens of thousands of years after Toba, some scientists suggest the eruption may have weakened their populations, reducing their genetic diversity and leaving them more vulnerable in the long run. Farther east lived the Denisovans, a mysterious sister species known today mostly from fragments of bone and teeth. Their range stretched across the high mountains and broad plains of Asia, from Siberia to Southeast Asia. Did they too huddle in caves as the skies dimmed? Did they sing songs around their fires, or paint symbols on stone? We cannot know for certain, but genetic evidence shows they mingled with both Neanderthals and Sapiens, leaving behind traces of their legacy in modern humans from Asia to Oceania. The volcanic winter would have pressed heavily upon them as well, perhaps pushing populations into refuges, thinning their numbers, and shaping the future of their encounters with us. Even more mysterious are the so-called ghost populations hinted at in our DNA, groups of archaic humans we have yet to name, who once walked the earth but vanished without leaving fossils we have discovered. The Toba eruption may have been one of the forces that drove some of these forgotten branches to extinction, narrowing the human family tree until only a few lineages remained. For Sapiens, encountering these other humans during such a crisis must have been a moment of tension and ambiguity. Imagine stumbling upon another band of survivors, not quite like us, but close enough to recognize ourselves in them. Did we compete with Neanderthals and Denisovans for dwindling resources? Did we fight them for shelter, for prey, for territory? Or did we, at times, share, trade, and even intermarry, as genetic evidence later confirms, the volcanic winter likely heightened both conflict and cooperation. It is a haunting thought, the survival of our species may have hinged on these encounters. Where sapiens brought flexibility, varied diets, symbolic culture, and perhaps more sophisticated language, Neanderthals brought strength and resilience. Denisovans carried adaptations to high altitudes and rugged terrains. In some cases, we may have absorbed their strengths through interbreeding, carrying forward their genetic gifts into future generations. In others, our adaptability may simply have outlasted theirs. Consider the Neanderthal child buried in a shallow grave in what is now France, her body placed carefully, perhaps with flowers. Even in their struggle, Neanderthals carried ritual, care, and meaning. They were not brutish shadows, but humans in their own right. Did they look to the darkened skies and invent their own myths of catastrophe? Did they tell their children stories to ease their fear? In many ways, their struggle mirrors ours. Yet prehistory shows us the outcome. Over the next tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals would dwindle. Denisovans would fade into the genetic background, and only sapiens would endure in vast numbers. Was the Toba eruption the first great winnowing of the human family? Perhaps it was not the sole cause, but it may have tipped the scales, reducing populations, isolating groups, and forcing migrations that set us on a collision course with rivals. The shadows of these other humans remain with us today. Every time we look into the mirror, a fraction of our DNA whispers of Neanderthals. High-altitude populations, like Tibetans, carry gifts inherited from Denisovans. In this way, the volcanic winter did not only test our ancestors, it braided the fates of multiple human species into a single story. And so, the winter that almost ended all human life was also the winter that reshaped the human family tree. Some branches snapped, others intertwined. One, ours, grew stronger, but only because it carried within it the echoes of those who stood beside us in the ash and the dark. When we speak of survival, then, we should not imagine sapiens alone, triumphant and isolated. We should imagine a crowded stage of humanity, each lineage struggling, adapting, hoping. Some survived a little longer, some disappeared, but all played their part in the drama of endurance. Without them, we would not be who we are. The shadows of other humans walked through that long volcanic night with us. They left behind no monuments, no books, no songs we can still hear. But their presence is etched into our bones, into our blood, into the very structure of our minds. They too survived the winter, if only through us. When Mount Toba erupted, it was not only humans who suffered, the earth itself was transformed. The landscapes that had nurtured countless generations of life were suddenly erased, rewritten in layers of ash and silence. It was not merely a volcanic eruption, it was a planetary resculpting. Across the Indian subcontinent, the ash fell thick and heavy. In some places, the layer was meters deep, burying entire valleys, forests, and rivers beneath a suffocating shroud. Imagine standing in a tropical forest once alive with birdsong and insects, now a wasteland of gray dust. The trees sagged under the weight of ash until they cracked and fell. Rivers clogged, fish suffocated, their scales coated in fine volcanic powder. Insects, the base of the food web, died in massive numbers, leaving silence where once there was a constant hum of life. Even far from the eruption's epicenter, the earth changed. Winds carried the ash across oceans, spreading it like a veil. In Africa, thousands of kilometers away, thin blankets of volcanic dust settled over grasslands and savannas. Herds of antelope, zebras, and elephants sniffed the air, confused by the strange gray haze that dimmed the sky. Vegetation browned and withered. Grazing animals struggled. Predators, in turn, found less prey. The whole web of life began to unravel. Forests collapsed not only from ashfall but from darkness. Plants rely on sunlight, and sunlight was now scarce. For years, the skies remained murky. The sun became a dim, cold orb, unable to pierce the haze of sulfur and ash that circled the globe. This was more than a local disaster. It was a planetary winter. Across Asia, Africa, and beyond, ecosystems shriveled. Jungles retreated. Grasslands turned to barren plains. Wetlands dried, their delicate life chains snapping one by one. For countless species, this was extinction. Some plants never recovered. Some animals, already clinging to existence, vanished. It was a quiet apocalypse, not of fire and explosions, but of starvation, collapse, and stillness. But even in devastation, Earth is dynamic. Over time, the landscapes began to change in ways that were both destructive and creative. Rivers cut new paths through ash-clogged valleys. Floods carried fertile volcanic minerals downstream, enriching soils that, centuries later, would bloom with life again. Lakes formed in the hollows of volcanic scars. Some ecosystems would take centuries to return, others millennia, and some never returned at all. The eruption permanently redrew the ecological map of entire regions. In Sumatra itself, the volcano's collapse left behind a vast caldera, Lake Toba, one of the largest volcanic lakes on Earth today. Where once a mountain had stood, there was now a yawning wound in the earth, slowly filling with water. Its shores would, in time, cradle new forests. Birds would return. Humans, generations later, would fish its waters and wonder at its immensity, not realizing that the placid lake was the tombstone of a cataclysm. The landscapes of ash shaped human choices as well. Imagine a band of survivors venturing out from their cave to find their world transformed beyond recognition. The hunting grounds where they once stalked antelope were gone, buried under dust. Rivers they relied upon had dried or been poisoned. Paths to distant valleys were cut off by landslides. Migration routes of animals had shifted, or vanished altogether. The map inside the minds of these people, the ancestral memory of where food and water could be found, was suddenly useless. They were forced to explore, to adapt, to gamble their lives on finding new landscapes that still live. And yet, the very destruction carried seeds of renewal. Volcanic ash, though deadly in the short term, is rich in minerals. In the centuries after the skies cleared, regions once stripped bare became fertile cradles of life. Forests regrew, green and dense, their soils enriched by the nutrients released from deep within the earth. Grasslands flourished anew, and with them returned herds of grazing animals. For humans, this meant that survival, though agonizing in the immediate years, was eventually rewarded by landscapes that once again teemed with life. But at the time, it must have seemed like the end of the world. Imagine looking out across a plain of ash, the horizon blurred by haze, no birds in the sky, no sound of insects, no tracks of animals in the dust. Only silence. To live in such a landscape was to feel utterly alone on a wounded planet. For early humans, such emptiness would not only challenge their stomachs but also their minds. What stories did they tell to explain the death of their world? Did they imagine the gods had abandoned them? Did they fear the sun would never return? For the natural world, the eruption was a reset button. For humans, it was a test. To survive in these landscapes of ash, they had to read the signs of returning life, to follow the green shoots, to seek the animals that had not yet vanished. They had to become more than hunters and gatherers, they had to become interpreters of a broken earth. And even as landscapes suffered, they were never truly empty. In the cracks of ash, mosses and lichens took hold. In the rivers, some fish found refuge in deep waters. Some insects endured, clinging to life in sheltered hollows. Slowly, patiently, life began to whisper its return. The resilience of Earth itself mirrored the resilience of humans. Both would suffer. Both would adapt. Both would eventually recover. But the scars remained. Entire species vanished forever. Landscapes bore the mark of fire and ash for millennia. Even today, scientists can trace the fallout of Toba in sediments, in ice cores, in the chemistry of rocks. The earth remembers, even when we forget. The landscapes of ash after Toba were not just ruined terrains. They were theaters of survival, canvases upon which the drama of resilience was painted. For humans who walked those lands, the world had changed beyond recognition. But it was in those very changes that new pathways for life and culture were forged. The earth destroys. The earth renews. And in that cycle, humanity found both its greatest peril and its most enduring lesson. When the ash began to settle, when the skies still hung heavy and dim, fire became more than a tool. It became a symbol of survival itself. In the darkness of volcanic winter, where sunlight faltered and warmth was fleeting, fire was the heartbeat of humanity. Without it, no cave, no shelter, no body could withstand the cold nights that followed. Imagine a small group huddled in the mouth of a cave. Outside, the wind carried flecks of ash, and the air was sharp with bitterness. Inside, the fire flickered. It was small, fragile, fed with precious scraps of wood. Yet around it, life persisted. Children curled against their mothers. Elders sat with faces lined by both smoke and worry. Hunters returned with whatever morsels they could find. Fire was not just heat. Fire was light in the dark. Fire was hope that the world was not entirely gone. But fire alone was not enough. What mattered as much as the flames was the memory of how to keep it alive. To make fire required knowledge, the understanding of which stone sparked, which woods burned best, which grasses could coax an ember into flame. In an era of scarcity, the loss of this knowledge meant extinction. If even one generation failed to pass on the secrets of fire, its light could be extinguished forever. And so survivors guarded this wisdom carefully. Perhaps they wove it into rituals. Perhaps they taught their children not only through words but through songs, chants, and gestures. Knowledge, in a world without writing, lived in memory, in repetition, in tradition. A young child might have been told, "Watch how I strike these stones. Listen to the spark. Remember the smell of smoke. This is life. Carry it with you." In this way, the ember of culture was preserved alongside the ember of flame. But there was more than fire to preserve. The eruption had shattered landscapes and scattered communities, and in such upheaval, the continuity of human identity depended on memory. Stories became lifelines. Around the fire, elders spoke of the world as it once was, of forests now buried in ash, of animals that once roamed freely, of rivers that had flowed clear. For children growing up in a landscape of gray silence, these stories were anchors, reminders that the world had been alive before, and might be alive again. And within these stories lay warnings. Perhaps they remembered the ash falling like snow. Perhaps they spoke of the sky darkening, of days when the sun was no longer warm. Such memories, repeated through generations, may have given rise to myths of angry gods, of cosmic punishments, of great floods and fires. Though clothed in myth, they were vessels of truth, cultural memory of catastrophe encoded in symbols that humans could carry across millennia. Knowledge was also preserved in the way survivors used their environment. Hunting required memory, remembering migration routes of animals, remembering where plants could still grow, remembering which roots could sustain life when berries and fruits were gone. Gathering required memory too, the knowledge of which plants were edible, which were poisonous, which could heal the sick or soothe the injured. Every piece of practical knowledge was a thread in the fragile web that kept humanity from collapse. And memory was not only individual, it was collective. One person might remember how to build a fire. Another might remember how to fashion a spear. Another might know the call of a bird that still nested in the ashlands. Survival was not the work of one mind but of many, bound together in a net of shared wisdom. This was the quiet strength of humans, the ability to pool knowledge, to transmit it across generations, to build culture even in catastrophe. At night, the fire cast shadows on the walls of caves. Perhaps in those shadows the first sparks of symbolic art flickered. Survivors may have drawn lines, shapes, or even animals on stone, not only as decoration, but as memory, a way to fix in place what might otherwise be forgotten. What they recorded we cannot know. But we do know this, even in their earliest days, humans sought to leave marks, to anchor their experience in something lasting. In the silence after Toba, perhaps the first deliberate symbols of human resilience were born. Fire and memory together became humanity's twin guardians. Fire sustained the body. Memory sustained the spirit. Without fire, they would freeze. Without memory, they would forget how to live. And both were fragile. A spark can die in an instant. A story can vanish if left untold. Yet in the darkest epoch of our existence, both were kept alive. This survival was not just physical. It was cultural, emotional, spiritual. The act of preserving knowledge was also the act of preserving meaning. To remember was to resist annihilation. To teach was to defy extinction. To pass on a story was to declare, "We are still here. We will endure." And so, in the aftermath of Toba, humans did more than survive as biological creatures. They survived as beings of culture, of fire and memory, of story and symbol. The eruption nearly erased us, but it could not erase the flame of knowledge that flickered in our hands, nor the stories that glowed in our minds. It is possible that much of human mythology, from tales of great floods to fears of sky-darkening cataclysms, carries echoes of that time. Perhaps the memory of Toba lingers still, encoded in myths of fire and shadow, of gods who punish and renew. If so, then the eruption shaped not only our landscapes but also our imagination. It scarred not only the earth, but also our collective memory. In that sense, humanity's survival after Toba was not just an accident of biology. It was an achievement of culture. Fire and memory, carried together, allowed our species to endure a winter that nearly ended all life. There are moments in the history of life where survival is reduced to a thread so thin it seems impossible that it could hold. The eruption of Mount Toba was one of those moments, the single most perilous chapter in our species' story. For millions of years, life on Earth had endured extinctions and rebirths, but now the test fell directly upon us. The numbers are staggering. almost unthinkable. Genetic studies suggest that in the wake of the eruption, the global population of Homo sapiens may have fallen to just a few thousand individuals. Some estimates are even more chilling, as low as 2,000 or 3,000, scattered across Africa and beyond. To put this into perspective, if you filled a modern football stadium with fans, their number might outstrip the entire human population that existed on Earth after Toba. This is what scientists call a genetic bottleneck. In evolutionary terms, a bottleneck occurs when a population is reduced to such a small size that its genetic diversity collapses. Imagine a great river of life, wide and flowing with countless streams of possibility. Now imagine it forced through the narrowest crack in the rocks. Most of its channels are cut off, and only a few strands of water make it through. That is what happened to humanity. Before Toba, humans were diverse, not just in culture, but in biology. Different groups carried different genetic variations, shaped by local environments and histories. But when the population shrank to near extinction, most of that diversity vanished. The vast river of human possibility was reduced to a trickle. And from that trickle came all of us. Every human alive today is descended from that small remnant, those few thousand who endured the volcanic winter. When you look at a crowd, when you travel across continents and marvel at humanity's variety, it is humbling to realize that all of it, every language, every culture, every dream, traces back to survivors who could have fit within a single valley. The consequences of this bottleneck are visible even now. Compared to many other species, humans have remarkably low genetic diversity. 2 chimpanzees from neighboring forests can be more genetically different than 2 humans from opposite sides of the earth. This uniformity is a scar left by Toba, the silent memory of how close we came to vanishing. And yet we did not vanish. Somehow, despite the ash, the cold, and the hunger, a thread of life held on. But think about how fragile that survival was. A slightly larger eruption, a few more months of volcanic winter, a failure of fire, or memory, or cooperation, and that thread could have snapped. If it had, the story of humanity would have ended there. There would be no cities, no art, no history, no you, no me. The earth would have gone on without us, indifferent as it always has. To stand at the brink of extinction is not merely a biological fact. It is a philosophical mirror. It asks us to confront how precarious our existence truly is. We are accustomed to thinking of ourselves as permanent, inevitable, destined to rule the earth. But the Toba catastrophe reveals how fragile that assumption is. Our species was not inevitable. We were almost erased. Imagine the psychological weight upon those survivors, even if they could not name it as we do. For them, the collapse was not a number, not a statistic. It was the silence of abandoned camps. It was the absence of voices where once there had been many. It was the eerie emptiness of landscapes that should have been alive with people, animals, and sound. Children grew up in a world of scarcity, where every meal was uncertain, where every step outside the cave risked both hunger and cold. For them, the world must have seemed shrunken, stripped of abundance, stripped of certainty. To survive meant not just finding food and warmth, but finding meaning in the face of relentless loss. Perhaps this is why myths of near destruction echo through so many cultures, myths of floods that swept away almost all life, of fires that consumed the world, of skies darkened by punishment. These myths may not be literal memories, but they carry the weight of ancestral trauma, the deep imprint of a time when humanity itself nearly disappeared. And yet, paradoxically, this bottleneck may have shaped us in ways that ensured our survival. When populations are reduced, cooperation becomes essential. In a small group, every life matters. The death of one hunter, one fire keeper, one elder can tip the balance. This may have intensified the bonds of kinship, sharpened our instincts for empathy, and reinforced the value of shared memory. We often think of evolution as the survival of the fittest, the strong outlasting the weak. But Toba suggests another story, survival of the most cohesive. The groups that endured were not necessarily the most physically powerful, but the most culturally resilient, the most skilled at preserving fire, memory, and cooperation. In this sense, our survival was not only biological but social. Still, the sheer scale of loss cannot be overstated. The human lineage that might have branched into countless directions was pruned to a single fragile twig. Every invention, every work of art, every civilization that followed, from the first stone cities to the satellites orbiting above our heads, grew from that single twig. History itself is a story that almost never began. Standing at this brink, we are forced to reflect on the nature of survival. It is not guaranteed. It is not given. It is earned, through luck, resilience, and the stubborn will to endure. And in that endurance lies the seed of everything we are today. The near extinction after Toba is more than a scientific footnote. It is a reminder of humility. We who build skyscrapers and write symphonies are also the descendants of those who crouched in caves, keeping fire alive with trembling hands. We are the heirs of scarcity, the children of survival, the fragile continuation of a story that could have ended in silence. And perhaps that is why the knowledge of Toba moves us so deeply. It reminds us that civilization is not a monument carved in stone, but a flame carried through darkness. It reminds us that all our achievements rest upon the shoulders of a few thousand survivors who refused to let the fire die. The brink of extinction was real. The thread could have broken, but it did not. Against the ash, against the cold, against the silence, humanity endured. And from that fragile survival, the rest of history unfolded. After the eruption of Mount Toba, humanity did not vanish, but neither did it thrive. What remained were fragments, small, scattered bands of survivors, isolated from one another by vast distances, hostile climates, and the veil of volcanic ash that blanketed the earth. If the bottleneck was the great constriction of humanity's river of life, then these scattered tribes were its fragile rivulets, each trickling uncertainly toward an unknown future. Picture them, groups no larger than a few dozen, clinging to coastlines, caves, riverbanks, or hidden valleys. They had no sense of the global catastrophe as we describe it now. They only knew their own small world, reduced to hunger, ash-darkened skies, and the desperate search for food. For them, survival was not a grand narrative, it was a day-to-day question. Will the next hunt succeed? Will the next fire survive the night? Archaeological traces hint at these pockets of survival. In Africa, along the coasts of South and East Africa, caves show signs of continuous human presence through this period, hearths blackened by ancient fires, shells cracked open for food, tools chipped from stone. These were not thriving communities, but they were enduring ones. The sea provided a lifeline. Fish, shellfish, and seaweed remained reliable even as inland ecosystems faltered under the grip of volcanic winter. Elsewhere, small groups may have survived in sheltered highlands or forests, places where microclimates offered refuge. Imagine a group of families clustered in a hidden valley, their knowledge of edible roots and tubers keeping them alive when game animals grew scarce. Each valley, each river mouth, each cave may have been its own fragile world, a universe defined by the survival of a handful of people. The isolation of these groups cannot be overstated. Travel was perilous. The land was colder, harsher, unpredictable. Bands that once might have encountered each other, trading tools or stories, now found themselves cut off, separated by wastelands of ash and barren earth. A child born into one group might live and die without ever knowing another band of humans existed beyond their valley or shore. And yet, within these scattered groups, life continued. Babies were born, songs were sung, old stories were retold around fires. Even in the darkest winters, human beings created meaning. This, perhaps, is one of the most profound truths of survival. Even when stripped to the edge of existence, people do not live by food and fire alone. They live by memory, by ritual, by the shared bonds of kinship. But isolation came at a cost. With so few people in each group, every loss was devastating. The death of a skilled hunter, the disappearance of a fire keeper, the illness of a child, each could tip the balance of survival. Small populations are fragile not just biologically, but socially. The fewer the numbers, the more each life mattered to the group's continuation. One can imagine the silence of these scattered tribes, the eerie emptiness of the world around them. Where once there might have been other camps, other voices, now there was only wilderness and the knowledge, or perhaps the suspicion, that they were alone. That loneliness may have been as crushing as the hunger. And yet, paradoxically, it was this scattering that ensured survival. If all humans had lived together in one region, one unlucky shift in climate or one failed harvest could have erased us entirely. But spread thinly across different environments, some groups endured where others failed. Diversity of habitat became a lifeline. The coast, the valley, the cave, the highland, each provided its own fragile refuge. This scattering also meant that humanity's survival was never inevitable. Some groups vanished, leaving no descendants. Others shrank to nothing, their fires extinguished forever. We carry no memory of their names, no trace of their stories. They are the forgotten branches of our family tree, pruned by catastrophe. And yet a few groups, perhaps only a few dozen scattered across continents, endured just long enough to pass on their genes, their skills, their knowledge. Think about the precariousness of that. All of us, every person alive today, descends from these survivors, from these scattered tribes. Not from a vast and thriving species, but from remnants, from outposts of resilience clinging to the edges of an unforgiving world. For them, there was no sense of destiny, no thought that their endurance would one day lead to civilizations, art, and science. There was only survival. But in surviving, they carried the seed of all that was to come. This image, of scattered tribes enduring against impossible odds, adds another layer of humility to our story. We are not the descendants of the mighty, the numerous, or the invincible. We are the descendants of the scattered, the fragile, the overlooked. Those who crouched in caves and ate shellfish along the shore. Those who kept the fire alive when the world outside was frozen and silent. And perhaps this scattering taught us something about resilience. In isolation, each group had to rely on its own ingenuity. They could not depend on a vast network of trade or shared resources. They had only themselves, their memory, their hands, their courage. Out of that necessity may have come the seeds of creativity, adaptability, and stubborn endurance that define humanity to this day. When we imagine these tribes, it is easy to see only the hardship. But there must also have been moments of wonder. Even under ash-darkened skies, the stars would still have appeared at night. Fires still crackled. Children still laughed. Life, even at the edge, has a way of asserting itself. And it was enough. Enough to carry us through the silence of the volcanic winter. Enough to ensure that when the skies finally cleared, when the forests regrew, when the rivers flowed once more, there were still human beings left to step into the light. The scattered tribes did not know it, but they were the keepers of the human future. Isolated and fragile, they held the thread of life through one of Earth's darkest winters. And from their survival, the great story of humanity could begin again. When the eruption of Mount Toba finally subsided, the Earth was left scarred. The roar of the volcano gave way to silence, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was heavy, eerie, unnatural. The world seemed muted, as though wrapped in a blanket of ash that dulled sound, sight, and even time itself. These were the silent years. Imagine stepping outside your shelter after the fury of the eruption. The air is still gray, the ground coated in layers of fine dust that shift like powder with each footstep. Forests stand stripped of leaves, their branches skeletal against a dim sky. Rivers run sluggish and clogged with debris. The world looks less like the living earth and more like a painting done in monochrome. For the survivors, the scattered tribes we spoke of, this silence was both a curse and a strange reprieve. The chaos of the eruption was gone, but in its place lay a strange stasis. The world did not immediately heal. The climate remained cold, the skies clouded, the land barren. The survivors were caught in a liminal space. The worst was over, yet the future had not begun. Food remained scarce. Many animals had fled, perished, or dwindled in number. The great herds that once thundered across the plains were gone, replaced by thin, desperate remnants. Hunters returned to their old paths only to find emptiness. Gatherers scraped at barren soil for roots, or turned to coastlines for whatever the sea might provide. Each meal was still uncertain, each fire, a small victory. And yet, despite the hardship, there must have been a strange, quiet beauty to these years. Nights, though cold, revealed skies studded with stars once the ash began to thin. Fires glowed warmly against the gray world, their smoke curling upward to vanish into low clouds. In the hush of the aftermath, every sound, the crackle of flame, the cry of a child, the splash of water, was amplified, carrying more weight than before. The silence was also cultural. With so few people, with tribes so isolated, the exchange of stories slowed. Myths and songs might have been whispered to children in the glow of firelight, but entire traditions could vanish with the death of one elder. It was a time of forgetting as much as a time of survival. Knowledge that had once been shared widely might now have flickered in only one or two memories, always at risk of being lost. Still, even in this fragile quiet, humans adapted. Along coastlines, groups leaned more heavily on the sea. They learned the tides, the rhythms of shellfish, the migrations of fish. Along rivers, people returned to hidden caches of tubers and seeds, learning again how to coax life from seemingly barren ground. Even in a diminished world, patterns could be discerned, and those who learned them survived. The silence also gave space for reflection. Unlike the eruption itself, which demanded immediate reaction, immediate escape, the aftermath offered long hours of waiting. Waiting for the weather to improve. Waiting for animals to return. Waiting for children to grow. In those stretches of waiting, around the fire or beneath the stars, people must have wondered, was this the end of the world? Would the forests ever grow again? Was humanity alone now? Perhaps this was the birth of certain myths, stories of great fires in the sky, of darkness that blanketed the earth, of trials sent by gods or spirits. Catastrophes often leave their mark on human memory not just physically but spiritually. The silent years may have been a crucible not only for survival, but for imagination. Out of loss and emptiness, meaning had to be created. But silence does not last forever. Slowly, imperceptibly, life began to return. Insects first, buzzing along the edges of streams. Small plants pushing shoots through layers of ash. Birds finding their way back to the desolate forests. These signs of life were subtle at first, but to the survivors they must have been monumental. A sprig of green against a gray hillside. The first sight of deer tracks in months. The call of a bird breaking the silence. Each was a promise. The world was not dead. And yet recovery was uneven. Some regions remained barren for decades, locked in cold and dust. Others, blessed with better rainfall or sheltered microclimates, healed faster. To one tribe, the silent years might have stretched endlessly. To another, a gradual abundance returned within a generation. Survival was still a lottery of geography, patience, and chance. This uneven recovery shaped the human story that followed. Some groups dwindled further, their lineages lost to the silence. Others found small abundance and began to grow again. From those fragile beginnings, the human population would eventually expand, but only after centuries of quiet endurance. In a way, the silent years are a forgotten chapter of our history. We speak of the eruption, of the bottleneck, of survival, but the long, drawn-out hush that followed is harder to imagine. Yet it was here, in the aftermath, that humanity truly proved its resilience. Survival in chaos requires instinct and speed. Survival in silence requires patience and hope. And hope, though fragile, was not extinguished. Fires still burned. Children still played, even in the ash. Elders still told stories of brighter times, keeping alive the memory of abundance. The human spirit, though tested, did not yield. When we look back on this time, we should not only see desolation. We should also see the quiet persistence that carried humanity through. The silence was heavy, but it was not final. It was the pause before renewal, the breath between catastrophe and recovery. The survivors did not know it, but the earth was already healing, slowly and silently. In time, forests would return, animals would repopulate, and skies would clear. Humanity too would grow again. But for those who lived through it, the silent years were an entire lifetime, a world defined not by abundance or progress, but by endurance and waiting. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the beating of human hearts, the crackle of fire, the whisper of stories, the first green shoots pushing through ash. Out of that silence, a new chapter of humanity was born. When we look back on the aftermath of Toba, it is easy to focus on the ash, the cold, the silence. But the true legacy of this catastrophe is hidden not in the ground, but in us. In every human alive today, there may echo the faint shadow of a near-extinction event, a genetic bottleneck that shaped our species forever. To understand this, we must imagine humanity reduced to a fraction of its former self. Some scientists suggest that the global population of Homo sapiens may have fallen to as few as a few thousand breeding individuals. Others argue the numbers were higher, perhaps tens of thousands. But the consensus is clear. Humanity came dangerously close to the edge. And what happens when a species passes through such a narrow gate of survival? The answer lies in genetics. A bottleneck reduces diversity. Traits that were once widespread may vanish forever if the individuals carrying them are lost. Variations in eye color, hair type, resistance to disease, even subtle psychological tendencies, all may be stripped away in the randomness of survival. It is as though humanity's great tree of possibility was pruned violently, leaving only a few branches from which the future would grow. Modern genetic studies have revealed something unusual. Humans are far less genetically diverse than many other species. Two chimpanzees in Africa, for example, may differ from one another more than two humans from opposite ends of the earth. This genetic closeness is a clue. It suggests that at some point, our population shrank dramatically. Toba is one of the leading suspects. Imagine it, entire lineages lost in the ash and cold, their stories gone forever. Entire clans extinguished, their songs and languages leaving no trace. And from what remained, a few small groups scattered across Africa, and perhaps beyond, the entire human future would unfold. This genetic narrowing had consequences both perilous and profound. On one hand, reduced diversity makes a species vulnerable. With fewer variations, there are fewer chances of resistance to disease or adaptation to new challenges. A single epidemic, a single shift in climate, could in theory threaten the whole species again. But on the other hand, this narrowing may have played a role in binding humanity closer together. With fewer genetic differences, humans became more uniform, more alike across regions. Perhaps this helped us recognize one another more easily as kin, smoothing the path toward cooperation. Perhaps it made the shared human story feel tighter, more universal. Consider language. With fewer groups surviving, fewer tongues and dialects may have persisted. The survivors' languages would become the seeds from which the great linguistic families of the future sprouted. Had other groups survived, the world's languages might look entirely different today. Consider culture. A bottleneck does not erase creativity, but it channels it. Small groups often develop strong identities, tightly woven stories, and shared rituals. In the aftermath of Toba, cultural traditions may have intensified, serving as glue to hold fragile communities together. And consider imagination. When survival depends on ingenuity, memory, and cooperation, the traits that favor those qualities become central. It is possible that the bottleneck not only reduced diversity, but also sharpened certain capacities, resilience, social bonding, foresight, that would help humanity thrive in the millennia to come. Of course, this is not certain. The genetic bottleneck theory tied to Toba is still debated. Some scientists argue that humanity's low diversity could stem from earlier or later events, or from the natural smallness of early human populations. Others believe that while Toba was devastating, it may not have reduced humanity as much as once thought. But even if Toba was not the sole cause, the principle remains. Our species is marked by fragility. Unlike ants or wildebeests, we are not a species of billions with endless variation. We are the children of a narrow survival, the descendants of people who endured a razor-thin margin of existence. And this has shaped not just our biology, but our philosophy. The awareness, even if subconscious, that humanity is precarious, that we could vanish, that we once nearly did vanish, lingers in our myths and stories. Many cultures hold tales of floods, fires, and trials that nearly ended humanity. Perhaps these are echoes carried through time, the memory of bottlenecks. Think of it, every human alive today may be linked not just metaphorically, but genetically, to a handful of survivors who endured the ash winter. That means you, me, everyone listening, we are all kin in a very real sense, carrying the same fragile thread of survival forward. It is a humbling thought. Our diversity in culture, language, and appearance is dazzling today. Yet beneath it lies a startling sameness, a closeness born from having once been few. The narrow gene pool also teaches us a lesson about chance. Survival was not necessarily about strength or superiority. It may have been geography. A group happened to be in a region with better rainfall, or near a coastline rich in shellfish. It may have been luck. An eruption cloud missed them, or a hunt succeeded at just the right moment. The entire future of humanity may have hinged on accidents of circumstance. This raises philosophical questions. If humanity had vanished, what then? Would another species have risen to take our place as thinkers, storytellers, builders of civilizations? Or would the earth have continued without such creatures at all? Was our survival inevitable? Or was it a roll of the cosmic dice? The narrowness of our genetic inheritance suggests the latter. We were not guaranteed. We were improbable. And yet, here we are. The consequences of this bottleneck ripple into the present. Medical researchers note the challenges of studying diseases in a species with limited diversity. Anthropologists trace our shared origins to surprisingly recent ancestors. Philosophers reflect on how thin the line is between survival and extinction. But perhaps the most profound consequence is personal. The knowledge that each of us carries within ourselves the mark of survival, that we are here because a fragile chain was not broken, should inspire both humility and awe. We are the descendants of a few. We are the children of those who endured ash, silence, and hunger. Our gene pool is narrow, but our possibilities are vast. Out of scarcity, abundance has grown. Out of fragility, strength has emerged. Out of near extinction, the human story continued. And that story was only just beginning. The world was healing, and so were we. The silence was giving way to sound, the ash to green. Out of the narrowness of our survival, humanity was poised to expand once more, and with it, to shape a future no one in those dark years could have imagined. When we speak of prehistory, we often imagine silence, a time before writing, before records, before the keeping of memory. But humans have always remembered. Long before clay tablets or parchment, we carried memory in our voices, in our rituals, in our myths. The question is, could the story of Toba, the winter that nearly ended us, have survived in some form, passed down through tens of thousands of years? At first, it seems impossible. How could words endure for so long, across so many generations? How could memory span not centuries but entire geological epochs? And yet, when we look at the deep structures of myth, a strange possibility emerges. Perhaps humanity did remember. Not in detail, not as a precise chronicle, but as a haunting echo, a tale of fire, darkness, and survival. Anthropologists have long studied flood myths, destruction stories, and apocalyptic traditions. Across cultures, we find recurring themes: the world ending in fire, the sun disappearing, the earth covered in ash or water, the desperate struggle to survive. These stories exist on every continent, in every tradition. Could they be faint, distorted memories of real events like Toba? Consider the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. Their oral traditions, known as the Dreamtime, contain stories that have been shown to preserve accurate memories of landscapes as they existed more than 10,000 years ago, tales of coastlines swallowed by rising seas after the last ice age. These oral memories outlasted stone and bone. They endured through song and story. If such memories can last 10,000 years, might others have lasted even longer? Imagine a clan huddled in the darkness after the eruption. A grandmother tells the children of the fire that came from the sky, of the months of cold, of the animals that vanished. She tells them as a warning, remember this, so that if it happens again, you will be prepared. Those children grow old, and they pass the story on. Slowly, over generations, details blur. Ash becomes fire. Cold becomes darkness. But the core remains: the world ended once, and we survive. When we look at myths of fire and destruction, the resemblance is uncanny. In Hindu cosmology, cycles of destruction by fire and flood mark the passing of ages. In Greek myth, the story of Phaeton tells of the sun's chariot veering out of control, burning the earth. In Native American traditions, stories speak of the sun disappearing, of long winters and hunger. Even the biblical tale of a flood, though tied to water, echoes the theme of near-total destruction followed by renewal through a chosen few. Are these coincidences? Or are they fragments, distorted echoes of a shared prehistoric memory of catastrophe? Skeptics argue that destruction myths are universal simply because human imagination gravitates toward them. Every culture faces storms, fires, famines. Every group knows hunger and fear. To imagine the end of the world is natural, inevitable. Myths of destruction may not be memories, but metaphors. Yet the persistence of specific imagery, fire from the sky, darkness lasting months, the world reduced to silence, feels too close to dismiss. These are not ordinary disasters. They are planetary in scale. And we know that once, around 74,000 years ago, something planetary did indeed occur. Memory, of course, does not travel intact across such gulfs of time. It mutates, reshapes itself to fit the culture telling it. What begins as an eruption may become a god's punishment. What begins as ash may become a flood. What begins as survival may become salvation. But perhaps, hidden beneath the layers of symbolism, a faint truth endures. This raises a haunting possibility, that somewhere within the myths we still tell today, in the stories of apocalypse, of wrathful gods, of worlds ending and beginning again, there lingers the echo of Toba. That deep within our cultural memory, we carry the shadow of the winter that almost ended us. If this is true, then myth is not just fantasy. It is fossilized memory, a form of cultural DNA. Just as our genes carry the record of our near extinction, our stories may carry the memory of it too. One biological, one cultural, two parallel ways in which humanity remembers. This perspective changes how we see myth itself. Rather than dismissing it as primitive superstition, we begin to see it as an archive. Imperfect, poetic, but real. A bridge from the deep past to the present. The people who lived through Toba did not write, but they sang. They told stories. And through those stories, they may still speak to us. There is a deep poignancy in this thought. Imagine that, as you listen to a myth told around a fire today, a tale of fire, flood, or darkness, you are hearing, however faintly, the voices of ancestors who lived through the cold and ash of Toba. Imagine that the terror they felt, the awe they experienced, is still with us, disguised as legend but unchanged in its emotional truth. And perhaps this is why myths of apocalypse resonate so powerfully even now. When we watch films about the end of the world, when we dream of global catastrophe, when we feel the strange fascination of destruction, perhaps it is not just imagination. Perhaps it is memory, buried deep in our collective psyche, a memory of the time it nearly happened. This makes the human story even more extraordinary. We did not only survive Toba physically, we may have survived it culturally, carrying its memory in myth across tens of thousands of years, until writing, until film, until today. The shadows of that winter may still flicker in the stories we tell one another now. And in this way, myth and science meet. Science shows us the ash in the earth, the sulfur in the ice cores, the narrowing of our genes. Myth whispers the rest, the terror, the awe, the sense of the world ending. Together, they give us the full picture. Toba was not just an event. It was an experience. It imprinted itself not only on the earth but on the human imagination. And that imagination has carried it across the millennia, disguised, but enduring. The shadows of memory still linger, and they remind us of a truth too deep to forget. We are the descendants of survivors, and we carry their stories, whether we realize it or not. 74,000 years ago, humanity faced a trial that could have ended our story before it truly began. The eruption of Mount Toba was not just a geological event, it was a test of endurance, resilience, and adaptation. Today, looking back, we are not only reconstructing what happened, we are asking what it means. What does Toba tell us about the nature of human survival? What lessons can we carry forward from the ashes of that ancient catastrophe? The first lesson is one of fragility. Toba reminds us how small we are in the face of planetary forces. A single eruption, lasting just days, reshaped climates across continents. A cloud of ash and sulfur, unseen once it dispersed, altered the fate of species for centuries. Humanity was reduced, perhaps, to a handful of scattered and vulnerable groups. We survived, but barely. This challenges our usual image of ourselves as masters of the earth. We build cities, dam rivers, split atoms, and send probes beyond the solar system. Yet all of it could be undone in a moment. The earth is not fragile, we are. The forces that shape this planet are vast, indifferent, and unstoppable. To recognize this is humbling, and necessary. The second lesson is resilience. For though we were fragile, we did not vanish. Somehow, in the cold and ash, our ancestors endured. This was not through power, but through adaptability. Humans are not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the fiercest species. What makes us remarkable is our ability to adjust, to change our diets, to migrate across impossible distances, to invent new tools, to alter our ways of living. In the wake of Toba, this adaptability may have been the difference between extinction and survival. A clan that learned to hunt new prey, that stored food, that cooperated more closely, these small advantages mattered. The eruption forced us to change, and that change shaped what we would become. In a sense, Toba forged humanity. It winnowed us, tested us, and left us stronger. A third lesson lies in memory. The scars of Toba may remain not only in our genes but in our cultures. Myths of fire, flood, and darkness may be echoes of that time. If this is true, then humanity did not merely survive, we remembered. And memory itself became a tool of survival. To carry forward the story of catastrophe, whether as warning, as ritual, or as myth, is to give the future a chance to prepare. This may be the most important lesson. Survival is not just about enduring the present, but about preparing for the future. The people who lived through Toba could not know what we would become, but by passing on their memories, their stories, their caution, they gave us something more than survival. They gave us resilience across time. And so we must ask, what would it mean to honor that gift today? Our world is not so different from theirs, though the scale of our powers has grown. We too live under the shadow of catastrophe. Volcanic eruptions still threaten us. Supervolcanoes like Yellowstone or Taupo slumber, and though their eruptions may be rare, their consequences would be global. Beyond geology, we face other threats: climate change, pandemics, nuclear war, asteroid impacts. Different in kind, but similar in effect, disruptions so great they test the fabric of human survival. Toba teaches us that survival is not guaranteed, that we are vulnerable. But it also teaches us that survival is possible. We survived once before with fewer tools, fewer numbers, less knowledge. If they endured, so can we. The difference is that we now carry the responsibility of foresight. We can study, model, and prepare. We can act before disaster strikes. But will we? That is the deeper question. For survival is not only about biology, it is about wisdom. The people of Toba had no choice but to adapt. We do. We can choose to ignore warnings, to live as though catastrophe is impossible. Or we can choose to learn from the past, to carry the lessons forward. Another lesson of Toba is unity. Survival was not an individual achievement. It was collective. A lone human in the cold and ash would not last long. It was clans, bands, families, groups that shared, protected, and cooperated, that carried the species forward. In the modern world, this remains true. No nation, no people, can face global catastrophe alone. Our survival, like theirs, depends on one another. There is also a philosophical lesson, one harder to accept. Catastrophe is part of the human story. The world does not promise us safety. Extinctions happen. Species vanish. The fact that we are still here is extraordinary, but it is not guaranteed to continue. To live with this knowledge is to see life as more fragile, but also more precious. Every generation, every life, is a triumph against the odds. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of Toba, not despair, but gratitude. We are here because others endured unthinkable trials. Their hunger, their fear, their resilience, all of it gave us this chance. We inherit not only their genes, but their courage. When we look at the night sky, or build our civilizations, or tell our stories, we are carrying forward a legacy bought at unimaginable cost. From this perspective, survival itself becomes sacred. It is not something to take for granted, but something to honor, protect, and continue. The people who lived through Toba gave us a future. The question is, what kind of future will we give to those who come after us? Toba whispers a warning across the ages, that survival is fragile, that unity is strength, that adaptability is life. But it also offers hope, that even when the world darkens, even when everything seems lost, life can endure. Humanity can endure. The ash of Toba still lies buried in the earth, a record of disaster. But in our existence, in our thriving numbers, in our dreams and achievements, there is another record, one not of disaster, but of survival. We are that record. The eruption of Mount Toba is often described as the greatest natural disaster of the last 2 million years. But as with all stories carried across tens of thousands of centuries, the truth is layered, complex, and contested. While the ash still lies buried in sediments, while the ice cores still record the faint whispers of its sulfur, the meaning of Toba, its impact on climate, on humanity, on survival itself, remains debated. Modern science is still unraveling the mystery. One of the boldest ideas about Toba emerged in the 1990s, the Toba catastrophe theory. Proposed by geneticists and paleoanthropologists, it argued that the eruption triggered a volcanic winter so severe it nearly wiped humanity out, reducing us to a tiny remnant population. This, they claimed, explained the so-called genetic bottleneck found in human DNA, the strikingly low genetic diversity compared to other primates. According to this theory, almost everyone alive today descends from just a few thousand survivors, perhaps fewer. It is a compelling idea. The thought that humanity once stood on the brink of extinction, clinging to survival in a handful of scattered groups, is both terrifying and awe-inspiring. It gives drama to our story. We should not exist, and yet we do. But compelling stories are not always the whole truth. As the years passed, new research began to challenge the Toba catastrophe theory. Studies of African archaeological sites found evidence of human continuity across the eruption. Stone tools in South Africa, for instance, appear both before and after the ash layers, showing no sign of sudden disappearance. People, it seems, carried on their lives, adapting, but not vanishing. In India too, stone tool industries continued across the ash deposits left by Toba, suggesting resilience rather than collapse. Climate records have also raised questions. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica do show a cooling after Toba, but how severe it was, and how long it lasted, is debated. Some models suggest a drop in global temperature of up to 15 degrees Celsius in certain regions, while others argue the effects were patchy and short-lived. For some scientists, Toba was catastrophic. For others, it was disruptive but survivable. The debate runs deeper into the realm of genetics. While humans are indeed unusually homogeneous genetically, it is not certain that Toba alone explains this. Other bottlenecks, migrations, or social structures may also have reduced diversity. The genetic signal may be older, or it may be the result of multiple events layered together. To pin it all on Toba, some argue, is too simple. What is remarkable is that even in the 21st century, the story is not settled. Every new dig site, every new analysis of ice or DNA, reopens the question. Some scientists argue Toba nearly ended us. Others argue humanity weathered it with less difficulty than once imagined. The truth may lie somewhere between, a disaster that scarred landscapes, changed climates, and challenged humans, but did not almost annihilate us. This uncertainty is not weakness, it is the strength of science. Unlike myth, which offers certainty through story, science thrives on doubt, revision, and debate. The fact that we still argue over Toba shows that the past is not fixed but alive, a puzzle being pieced together across disciplines. The Toba debate also reflects something deeper, our fascination with fragility. Why are we so drawn to the idea that humanity once came within a breath of extinction? Perhaps because it forces us to see our lives as contingent, precarious, precious. To imagine our species reduced to a few scattered bands in the ash is to imagine the knife edge of existence. Even if the strict catastrophe theory is wrong, the very possibility shapes our imagination. And so scientists continue to test, refine, and argue. Volcanologists map the deposits of Toba's eruption, measuring the thickness of ash, calculating the sulfur injected into the atmosphere. Paleoanthropologists examine archaeological sites for signs of disruption or resilience. Geneticists run simulations, comparing DNA diversity across species, hunting for the fingerprints of bottlenecks. Climate scientists model the effects of massive eruptions, testing scenarios of cooling, rainfall collapse, and ecosystem stress. Each line of evidence adds another piece, but the full picture remains incomplete. Meanwhile, the story seeps into popular culture. Documentaries, books, and articles often present Toba as the apocalypse that nearly erased us. This narrative has power, it dramatizes our survival, makes our existence feel miraculous. But scientists are careful, they know that to exaggerate is to risk misunderstanding. The past should inspire awe, but also caution. What we can say with certainty is this: Toba was vast, unimaginably vast. It reshaped environments, disrupted ecosystems, and left a mark visible across half the world. It challenged human communities, demanding resilience. Whether it nearly destroyed us or merely tested us, it remains a defining moment in the deep history of our species. And in this lies a final reflection: the debate itself is a kind of survival. The fact that we can argue about Toba, that we can measure ash layers, read ice cores, and decode DNA, is testimony to how far we have come. The people who lived through that winter could never have imagined their descendants debating the details of their survival tens of millennia later. Yet here we are, puzzling over their fate, turning their struggle into knowledge. The Toba debate is not only about the past. It is about who we are today, creatures who seek meaning, who turn catastrophe into story, who search for truth even when it is elusive. Whether Toba nearly ended us or merely humbled us, it continues to echo not in ash or ice, but in curiosity. And perhaps that curiosity is itself the ultimate survival tool. The eruption of Toba was not the end of humanity. It was, instead, a crucible. Out of ash and shadow, our species endured. We do not know precisely how close to the edge we came, whether we teetered on the brink of extinction or simply weathered a storm. But we know this: we survived. And survival itself changes everything. Imagine the scene thousands of years after the eruption. The skies have cleared. Forests regrow. Rivers run clear again. Children are born into a world no longer choked with ash. The memory of the long winter remains, carried in story, in silence, perhaps in ritual, but life pushes forward. This is humanity's second dawn, a rebirth from catastrophe. What does survival mean? It is not only that our ancestors endured physically, it is that they carried with them the seeds of what we would become. Their resilience, their ability to adapt to scarcity and hardship, their ability to hold on through darkness, these traits became part of us. We are their descendants, and within us is the echo of their endurance. In a way, every human achievement, every city built, every book written, every discovery made, is a continuation of that survival. The moment we stand on a mountaintop, or split the atom, or send a spacecraft into the void, we are living the second dawn that began when humanity refused to die in the winter of Toba. The fire that almost went out still burns, carried forward in us. There is also humility in this story. For all our power today, Toba reminds us that we are fragile. We live at the mercy of forces far greater than ourselves. One volcano, one shift in the Earth's crust, was enough to darken skies across continents. For a time, the sun itself was dimmed. If such power was possible once, it is possible again. Our existence is not guaranteed, but perhaps fragility is not weakness. Perhaps fragility is what gives life meaning. To know that we almost ended is to know that every life today is a continuation of a miracle. We are here not because survival was inevitable, but because survival was won, through courage, chance, and persistence. The second dawn is a reminder not to take existence for granted. As the world healed after Toba, humans spread once more. They moved through savannas, along coasts, across rivers, and eventually across continents. Each step carried with it the memory of survival. Though they may not have spoken of Toba by name, the memory of catastrophe lived in myths of floods, darkness, and fire. These myths, scattered across cultures, may be echoes of the same truth, that we endured when endurance seemed impossible. The second dawn was also a beginning for imagination. Out of hardship, humans dreamed. They began to shape meaning from survival. To live after disaster is to ask, why are we still here? What are we meant to do with this fragile, precious existence? These questions linger even now. Perhaps they first stirred when survivors gazed at clear skies after years of ash. Perhaps they asked, if the world can end, what is the purpose of life within it? The story of Toba is not only prehistoric, it is prophetic. It speaks to the choices we face now. Our ancestors endured forces of nature beyond their control. We, today, face forces partly of our own making: climate change, nuclear weapons, ecological collapse. Just as the eruption tested them, our choices test us. Will we carry the memory of survival forward, or will we forget? The second dawn is not a single moment. It is ongoing. Every time we choose to adapt, to preserve, to protect, we are living in its light. Every time we pass knowledge to the next generation, we are extending the flame that almost went out. The survivors of Toba could not have imagined skyscrapers, space travel, or global communication. But what they gave us was the possibility of all those things. They gave us time to become. There is poetry in this, that the greatest catastrophe was also a kind of gift. It showed us what it means to endure, to live not as inevitable conquerors but as fragile beings who survived against odds. Out of that fragility came strength, and out of that strength came everything that followed. And so, when we look back on Toba, we should not only see ash and ruin, we should also see the dawn, the moment when humanity proved it could bend without breaking, suffer without vanishing, endure without surrendering. We should see in that dawn the beginning of who we are. In the end, the winter that almost ended all human life did not end us. It defined us. It carved resilience into our bones and memory into our myths. It gave us the perspective to know that existence is fragile, and therefore precious. Today, as we look to the future, we stand again at thresholds. We face our own winters, some of them natural, some of them of our own making, but we carry within us the memory of Toba's survivors. We carry their endurance, their stubbornness, their will to keep going even when the sun itself was hidden. That memory is not written in stone or ash. It is written in us. This is humanity's second dawn, not just the moment the skies cleared after Toba, but the moment we realize what survival means. It is not enough to exist. To survive is to carry forward meaning, story, possibility. To survive is to turn darkness into dawn. And so the story of Toba is not finished. It lives in the air we breathe, in the curiosity we chase, in the fragility we acknowledge, and in the resilience we embody. It whispers to us, you almost ended, but you did not. You survived. And survival is only the beginning. From ash to light, from silence to song, from winter to dawn, humanity endures. The story of Toba does not belong only to the past. Though it unfolded some 74,000 years ago, its echoes ripple through every breath we take today. We stand here because of survival. We stand here because, in a world of ash and hunger, a handful of ancestors endured, refusing to vanish. The winter that almost ended all human life never fully ended, because its lessons are still with us. Pause for a moment and look around at the world as it is now. Cities stretch across continents. Skyscrapers rise into the sky. Airplanes cross oceans in hours. Satellites orbit above, transmitting signals that weave us into a single global web. All of this exists because the fire of humanity did not go out in the long volcanic winter. The fragility of that survival is easy to forget, hidden beneath the weight of our modern triumphs. But fragility remains. It is written into our story. When we reflect on Toba, we do not only reflect on disaster. We reflect on memory, on the ways catastrophe leaves traces in the human soul. In myths of fire, floods, and endless nights, we may hear whispers of that ancient winter. The people who endured did not record their experiences in writing, but they carried them in story, in ritual, in silence. Generations later, those memories may have transformed into the legends that still haunt us today. And what do these echoes say? They say that we are small beneath the power of the earth, that our existence is never guaranteed, that the ground we walk upon, the air we breathe, the sun we depend upon can shift in an instant. They also say something more, that despite our smallness, survival is possible. That even when skies go dark and hunger spreads, the human spirit finds ways to endure. In this way, Toba is not only a tale of catastrophe but a mirror. It reflects who we were and who we are. Our ancestors faced the collapse of their world just as we face challenges of our own: rising seas, shifting climates, weapons capable of ending civilizations. We too live in the shadow of possible winters. The question is, will we remember? Will we carry forward the lessons of survival, or will we ignore them in the glow of modern life? Perhaps the deepest lesson of Toba is humility. We often speak of humanity as masters of the planet, as a species that dominates and reshapes nature. But the eruption reminds us that mastery is an illusion. We are not separate from Earth's power. We are part of it. We are creatures of fire and ash, bound by the same fragility as every other living thing. Our greatness lies not in control, but in adaptation. Yet there is also wonder here. For if our survival was fragile, it was also miraculous. Out of a handful of bands, scattered and struggling, came billions of lives, cultures, languages, histories. Every human alive today is a descendant of survival. Every song sung, every painting painted, every story told is an echo of the voices that did not fall silent in the volcanic winter. We are walking testaments to endurance. Sometimes, to grasp meaning, we must step outside of time. Imagine the earth looking upon itself across millennia. One age after another rises and falls. Glaciers advance and retreat. Forests grow and burn. Rivers carve valleys and mountains crumble. In that endless span, Toba was but a single moment. And yet, within that moment, humanity almost vanished. The balance was so fine, the outcome so uncertain, that our very existence today feels improbable. And yet improbable things happen. That improbability carries responsibility. If survival was not inevitable, then life is not something to waste. If existence is fragile, then each choice we make matters. To remember Toba is to remember that we are living on borrowed time, gifted by the endurance of those who came before. What will we do with that gift? Will we honor it with care, or squander it with neglect? The echoes of Toba urge us to humility, yes, but also to imagination. Our ancestors endured without knowing what lay ahead. They endured not for empire, not for technology, not for cities, but simply for life itself. Because of them, we have the privilege to dream, to create, to wonder. Survival was their gift, imagination is ours. And so, the story of Toba ends not in the past but in the present. Every moment we breathe, every sunrise we see, every laugh that rings across the air is part of its legacy. The ash has long settled, the skies long cleared, but the meaning remains. Life is fragile, life is resilient, and life is precious. When you stand beneath the sky at night, looking at the stars, remember that there was a time when our species nearly disappeared beneath a sky that seemed broken. When you feel the warmth of the sun, remember that there was a time when sunlight could not pierce the veil of ash. And when you wonder what it means to be human, remember that we are the children of survival. The winter that almost ended all human life is not simply a story of loss. It is a story of endurance, of transformation, of second chances. We are here because of it. We are who we are because of it. And in the end, that may be the greatest echo of all. From ashes, we inherited resilience. From darkness, we inherited imagination. From the brink of extinction, we inherited the possibility of everything that followed. These are the echoes of Toba. They live in us, and they remind us quietly that the future is still being written.